What up, AP Euro people? Today we're gonna take a look at how the global economy grew when Europe expanded. And keep in mind that in the addition to the agriculture improvement and population growth, the growth of Europe directly correlates with the growth of world trade. So Europe is gonna continue to colonialize, Britain is gonna impose the Navigation Act and ultimately become the most successful empire, and the Atlantic slave trade is doing pretty well for itself. And there's going to be a sense of new ethnic identities as people and ideas move around a lot more.
And one of the first acts implemented was by Oliver Cromwell in 1651, and it was called the Navigation Acts. The Navigation Acts required that the goods imported from Europe into England and Scotland had to be carried on British-owned ships with British crews, and it basically gave the British merchants a monopoly on trade with their colonies, since all the colonists had to buy British goods and sell to Britain. So from 1701 to 1763, England and France had multiple wars to fight over who would become the leading maritime power. And the first of these started in 1701 when Louis XIV accepted the Spanish crown willed to his grandson. And this really upsetted the continental balance of power. With a large coalition of different states and over 12 years of fighting, Louis XIV was finally forced into the Peace of Utrecht in 1713. But the 7 Years' War was the decisive round in the Franco-British competition for colonial power and the colonial empire. And all of the victories in North America was on the colonial front were finally ratified by the 1763 Treaty of Paris. France lost its possessions in Canada and all lands east of the Mississippi. And France also had to give Louisiana to Spain for Florida, which was lost to Britain. The French also had to give up its holdings in India, allowing the British to dominate the subcontinent.
18th century colonial trade. So during the 1700s, Britain's rate of sales growth to traditional European markets was beginning to decline. However, thankfully for them, sales to its colonies across the Atlantic were booming, increasing from £500,000 to £4 million in a very short span of time. And this made English exports become more balanced and diversified, which helped just further strengthen its economy. Now, although it lost much of its overseas territories, France was still profiting enormously off of plantation agriculture and slave trading from its colonies of Saint Dominique, Martinique, and Guadeloupe. Now, merchant classes in France's, mainly its large cities, soon joined the other kind of more established elites that were kind of clamoring for political power due to the increase in confidence that came from the merchant classes gaining so much wealth. Now, Spain became had a bit of a rise during this time as well, because it gained tons of territory from France when it was gifted the territory of Louisiana, and it also expanded its influence westward to Northern California through the efforts of some of their missionaries and ranchers. Also, they managed to find a recovery in their silver production for their silver mines in South America, which helped boost their profits immensely and grow their power to somewhat closer to where they were earlier.
The Atlantic slave trade, or transatlantic slave trade, involved millions of Africans who were torn from their homes, deported to the American continents, and sold as slaves. This led to the shore method. Under this system, instead of having to form trading posts, European ships sent boats ashore and invited African dealers to bring traders and slaves out onto their ships. This allowed for ships to move quicker from market to market. As the need for slaves increased, so did the wealth for the African merchants. With this newfound wealth, they were able to buy European goods, including guns. And because they wanted more money in goods, they attacked other African states to use them as slaves. And it turned out to be a cycle where they sold slaves, bought weapons, and then fought and obtained slaves and recycled. In the late 1780s, the anti-slave campaigns grew into massive movements. A big part of this was women who were fighting for the stressing and cruel treatment of female slaves and slave families. These attacks led to the British Parliament abolishing the British slave trade in 1807, although slavery continued in the British colonies and in the Americas for decades to continue.
Identities and communities of the Atlantic world. So as European contacts among the Atlantic coasts of the Americas, Africa, and Europe became more frequent, and as European settlements grew into well-established colonies, new identities and communities emerged. And attempts to classify and systematize these new racial categories that developed from these unions ended up influencing the developing Enlightenment thought on racial difference. And although uncommon, mixed race populations sometimes managed to rise to the colonial elite through the descendants of Spanish conquistadors. So colonial elites, like I said earlier, how they started to kind of step back from their pride in being European. They ended up becoming sort of Americanized by adopting some of these native foods, and they sought relief from disease in native remedies as opposed to some of the more standard European ones. So to kind of shift gears here a little bit, so galvanized a bit by the Protestant Reformation and the perceived need to protect and spread Catholicism, Catholic powers during this time actively sponsored missionary efforts in the New World. So Jesuits, Franciscans, Dominicans, and other religious orders ended up establishing missions throughout Spanish, Portuguese, and French colonies. Jews in colonies did face discrimination in those that were, of European descent. And although they were ineligible to be slaves due to their light skin tone, they did not enjoy equal status with Christians.
So between 1500 and 1600, the Portuguese were the big dog in the Indian Ocean trading world, and they had a really strong grip on the spice trade. But in 1602, the Dutch came and grabbed that power from the Portuguese, and the Dutch East India Company took control of the Portuguese spice trade in the Indian Ocean, and they had a port in Batavia in Java as its center of operations. The Dutch hold in Asia kind of faltered in the 1700s, and they got really bad competition from the English East India Company. And in 1764, the companies defeated the Mughal Emperor, and the first Governor General of Bengal was instated. And then Captain James Cook claimed the east coast of Australia for England in 1770, and he named it New South Wales. So basically, the trade of the Atlantic was inseparable from the trade of Asia, and Europeans were increasingly dominating commerce in both Africa and Asia. So that's going to do it for today. I hope you find colonialism exciting, and if you have any questions, you can post a comment down below. Click like on the video if you haven't done so, tell some friends to do the same, and let's get this Euro bread. Peace.